are recapping the recession that our economy just experienced. The early 1970s have been marked by a huge economic downturn with increasing inflation, high unemployment rates, as well as a decline in our country's GDP. Delaney, care to tell us about that?
Of course, Sam, thank you. So first off, let's start by explaining some of these terms you just heard Sam mention. We're going to discuss GDP and inflation real quick before we get into some of our data. So GDP is the gross domestic product of a country. This measures added or decreased value by how much or how little goods and services are produced in a year. This is measured quarterly or 4 times a year or annually. Inflation is the increase in prices but the decrease in purchase power. So let's look at this recession in 4 stages called the business cycle. The first stage is called the peak, in which the country experiences the highest points in their respective indicators. Our peak occurred around 1973 when our unemployment rate was around 4.8%. This is pretty good for an economy who is about to head into a recession. Our inflation rate was also around 8.8%, which is also fairly good considering we're going into a recession. The second stage is called the recession, actually. This decline started in January of 1974 and led to September of 1974, where we saw an overall decline in our GDP. We also experienced an increase in unemployment from 5.1 to 5.9%. Again, around 5.1 and increased to 5.9. Thankfully, we didn't see too much of an increase, but that's thanks to our service industry seeing an increase in production. Our healthcare, finance, and education providers proved to be an essential part of today's society. However, inflation did increase nearly 1% each quarter of 1974, starting the year at 10.2%, and by September it increased to 12%. I'm sure those grocery prices were starting to make more sense now. The third stage is the trough. We saw this from October of 1974 to March of 1975. GDP hit its lowest during this time at $5.957 trillion, and unemployment, on the other hand, hit a peak at 8.5% in the first quarter of 1975, right around here. Inflation also peaked at 12.2% and slowly started to come down as we were nearing the end of the recession. March of 1975 marked the worst point of it all, meaning only one thing could happen from here. We start to regrow our economy. This is a little bit of a more visual to understand our recession a little bit easier. So here again, we have the peak, the recession, the bottom of the bottom, our lowest point during the entire recession, and the last and final part of the recession is the expansion, which is what we are living through now. The head of the Council of Economic Advisors under our new Ford presidency had proposed the Ford-Greenspan proposed fiscal actions that emphasize tax cuts for people like you and I, and also an increase in taxes in foreign oil. Congress investigated this and decided to not move forward since the plan didn't actually include tax cuts for regular households. Instead, they passed their own plan for new tax cuts.
All right, thank you, Delaney. In October of 1973, one of the leading causes of this recession was actually the oil embargo placed by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This embargo banned all petroleum exports and enforced cuts in oil production. This was seen as retaliation for all countries that supported Israel in the Arab-Israeli War, including the United States of America. This had devastating effects on our economy. Our country's dependence on foreign oil, combined with our lack of domestic oil, had proved to have horrible effects on our economy, as well as dramatically increasing the price of oil to nearly quadruple its standard price. As we can see on this graph right here, during 1974, the price of oil increased by 158.9% in response to the oil embargo, the highest that it had ever been in history. But why exactly were we so impacted by the oil embargo of 1973? Multiple factors had been building up throughout the past decade, which is why our economy was hit so hard. Our country's dependence on foreign oil combined with our lack of domestic oil had proved to have horrible effects. And it wasn't just our dependence on oil, but also the devaluation of the US dollar and our involvement of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was one of the longest wars in US history, and it wasn't until March 29, 1973, that the United States military officially pulled out of the war, but had lasting effects on our country. Our involvement caused an increase in government and military spending, and this increase in spending caused a higher demand for labor and materials, and an overall increase in aggregate demand. This led to high inflation rates, and the high inflation combined with the oil embargo and devaluation of the dollar was why our economy went into recession. Lastly, in 1971, President Richard Nixon fought to combat the effects of the Vietnam War, and one of the ways he tackled the effects was through the US dollar. The Bretton Woods system was established to regulate and promote global trade post-World War II. They did this by standardization currency exchange rates, where the US dollar was based on the price of gold, which at the time was $35 an ounce. However, one time, this caused the dollar to become overvalued and contributed to rising inflation. In response to this, President Nixon suspended the ability to convert the dollar into gold. This caused the US dollar to lose its value because the price of oil was based in US dollars by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries was then losing profit due to the United States of America being their primary consumer and decided to switch their pricing of oil in terms of gold. The results of all these factors led to one of the biggest recessions that America has ever seen in the past few decades, with record high oil prices, high inflation rates, and high unemployment rates. And now we move on to Ryan.
Thank you, Sam, for that wonderful introduction. I will now be talking more on the monetary and the fiscal policy that Delaney and Sam both touched on at the end of their presentations. So following the oil embargo by OPEC, unemployment began to rise and so did prices in general, which caused inflation. The oil embargo cut off around 35% of the U.S. oil supply. This was a reaction made by the Arab OPEC members after the U.S. decided to support Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Gas and oil prices skyrocketed, and oil shortage made the economy rough. So here we can take a look at the unemployment graph. We see the unemployment from 73 up to 75 take a huge jump. Richard Nixon, who was the president from 1969 to 1974, attempted to battle the bad economy with waging and pricing controls. So in the middle of this ugly time, we had a president switch from Nixon to President Ford. In December of 1974, President Ford admitted that the economy was in a recession and followed with action. The following month, he called for a tax cut of $16 billion to stimulate the economy. In March, an official tax cut of $22 billion was used to reverse the recession. Here we see President Ford using a method of the expansionary fiscal policy in which the government uses tax revenue cuts, increases government spending, or a combination of both, in an attempt to stimulate the economy. Actually, Ford here only used a tax cut and made sure that the government spending stayed steady. So here we see our tax cut in the first quarter of 1975. He enacts it around here, and we see it really in effect here, this huge drop. This really stimulates the economy. And then we see back in quarter three, it kind of stays, it comes back up, it stays on this steady incline. We can also see here that the government spending around the time of the enactment of the tax revenue cut, that it stays pretty steady and there is no really increase. I mean, it is increasing, but that is the steady increase it was already on. There was no manual increase made to combat that recession. We can also see the monetary policy that we used to fight the high inflation was a gradual rise in the interest rates enacted by the central banks and the Federal Reserve. An example of this was when the Federal Reserve they raised the fund rate from around 6% in 1972, gradually up to 13% in 74. So here you can see the fund rates in 72, pretty low, and then they gradually start coming up and up and up, and then they really peak around here in 74. So the combination of the monetary policy and the fiscal policy was used all to combat this deadly recession.
All right, thank you, Ryan. And today that wraps up our recap. Thank you all for tuning in, and now Michael Constantino for the weather.